Welcome back to Sinclair Schools. And in this video, we're going to talk about the proposed budget for the 26-27 school year, fiscal year 27. So far, as we're approaching the development of the fiscal year 27 budget, we met last October to give the first annual State of the Schools address, which kicked off the beginning of the budget planning process for the fiscal year 27. Beginning in October and continuing on through the winter into the spring, board meetings included discussions of budget priorities, needs, and concerns, with a couple of specific focus areas around facilities maintenance and transportation, and a very specific board goal to shift the work that we do with the Edgecombe Town Budget Committee toward a discussion that allowed feedback to take place prior to the adoption of a final budget, rather than us simply presenting the budget that we had fully developed. This is why, after the March meeting with the budget committee, we went ahead and made some changes to the budget that we had shown to them. Those changes included reducing some of the facilities costs, specifically by removing the entirety of the flooring project. At their request, considering some updated bus options, one of which was either to lease or to increase maintenance, and considered some updated health insurance costs. We also, in an effort to be as fiscally conservative as possible, chose to remove our support for the IEP coordinator position. This allowed us to take some steps towards some significant board goals. In particular, in November and December, our meetings included increased public discussion, particularly around school nutrition. Our winter meetings had some specific, deeper discussions around facilities and transportation options and costs. And multiple meetings reaffirmed the need to keep the school costs well below 60% of property taxes. We also worked hard to shift the timing to increase opportunities for discussion and adjustments with the municipal organizations. We brought our budget sheet to the budget committee meeting with all of the possible options included in it, so that we had the opportunity collectively to pare down from the largest possible budget to one that was much more agreeable. We reduced those line items in accordance with budget committee feedback, and then went on to develop a paving proposal with select board input to ensure the best oversight. We are also working towards preparing friendly amendments to offer on the floor of the May 2nd meeting to adjust expenditures based on the latest numbers. We chose to move forward with that based on feedback that we received last year. We have a couple of ongoing goals, one of which is to clarify funding mechanisms for federal and state funding beyond the state subsidy. We're looking for ways to identify budget line items that are fully controlled at the local level, so that we can continue to increase public understanding of the fact that very few of those line items are directly under our control. And once again, we continue to have a goal of refunding the reserve accounts and clarifying the unassigned fund balance, but we are still waiting for the fiscal year 24 audit. It is important to consider the students involved. Historically, Edgecombe Eddy enrollment has increased since 2017 with the initiation of the pre-K program and the tuition-in students. This past year saw a decrease in resident students, primarily due to the fact that the most recent graduating class was fairly large. This year, the graph on the right shows the enrollment per grade by students who either live in Edgecombe or live in surrounding towns. One of the things that we are most proud of is the fact that our tuition-in students occupy vital places in all of our classrooms, bringing diversity to the school. It is also important to remember that this budget proposal includes the costs for educating the 59 Edgecombe resident students in grades 7 through 12, all of whom are tuitioned out to other schools. One of the other historical questions that is always important to remember is the state subsidy. State subsidy is the amount of money given to every municipality and school district according to the EPS funding formula in an effort to offset some of the cost of public education. Our state subsidy peaked in 2022 with the development of the first set of state budgets to fully fund 55% of school costs across the state. However, the following year, when we successfully paid off the remainder of the building, our state subsidy reduced to a little bit more than $400,000, and has slowly risen over the past few years to an estimated anticipated amount of $493,415 in fiscal year 27. The other piece of information that the school board considers every time we put forth a budget is anticipated tuition revenue. Historically, the actual tuition revenue, beginning all the way back in 2014, increased slowly every year until 2023 and 2024. At that point in time, it became increasingly obvious to both the community and the board that we were overly conservatively estimating anticipated tuition revenue. In the past 2 budget cycles, we have worked hard to properly anticipate while conservatively estimating the amount of anticipated tuition. We also have to take into consideration the fact that if a student who is attending Edgecombe Eddy as a tuition-in student also receives special education services, their special education additional tuition amount is also included, but it comes in as special education tuition revenue rather than regular education tuition revenue. Every year, I like to stop and review a little bit about the way in which funds flow in and out of the unassigned fund. So, if we consider all of the money that has been set aside for Edgecombe Eddy School and the education of Edgecombe students, all of those funds live in the unassigned fund as long as they have been raised or designated for educational purposes. Money enters the unassigned fund through one of 3 ways: the state subsidy, tuition revenue sent by surrounding towns, and the assessment paid by local taxpayers. Money leaves the unassigned fund once it has been voted on in the 11 cost centers during the process of adopting the annual budget. That money has been allocated for expenditures through the annual voting process. Throughout the course of the year, that money is spent to pay the bills, and any unspent but budgeted money is returned to the unassigned fund at the close of the fiscal year. If the town voters have authorized setting aside funds into a reserve account, the school board can make the choice to do that. We, as a board, have historically chosen to only make that move once we have the most updated, audited information possible. Running underneath and alongside this budgeting process is the grant application process. Grants, which could include private grants, but also include mechanisms such as title funding and IDEA funding, is something that is taken into consideration during the annual budgeting process, but must be treated through a separate budgeting mechanism due to the restrictions around those funds. Numbers that should be considered in the discussion of any annual budget. One is overall expenditures. Overall expenditures are categorized in 11 cost centers as dictated by state accounting. Cost center number 1 is regular education. This includes all general education, pre-K through 12 salaries for teachers and ed techs, substitute teacher salaries, benefits, classroom and instruction supplies, and professional development. In the planned fiscal year 27 budget, regular instruction line is up 9.9%, or approximately $220,000. This is predominantly due to salaries and insurance, but it also includes the tuition outgoing payments for students in grades 7 through 12, and that rose this year. Cost Center 2 covers special education. Special education this year is up 9.4%, or approximately $80,000. This covers special education teacher and ed tech salaries and benefits. It covers the special services costs that are determined by the AOS budget. And it also covers programs such as speech, psych, physical therapy, and occupational therapy, as well as tuition and fees for out-of-district services, but does not include transportation to such services. The change in this cost center is due predominantly to newly required services. Please note that if those costs are associated with students who tuition into the district, then matching revenue is received in order to offset those costs. Cost Center 3 is career and technical education. This would cover the cost of education received at vocational instructional programs. These programs occur at the secondary level, and thus, while there are Edgecombe students who are receiving them, none of them are directly funded through this budget, so this cost center is 0. Cost Center 4 covers other instruction. This would include areas such as co-curricular and extracurricular or summer school programs. Historically, this has been money that was set aside for the Chewonki Outdoor Encampment Program for the 6th grade. This is a long-standing Edgecombe Eddy tradition. Due to a significant rise in costs associated with the Chewonki program, the board, with the support of the administration, examined other options and has chosen to try a similar program affiliated with Hardy Roots this upcoming year. Because of this choice, this other instruction line has only gone up by approximately $500. Cost Center 5 is student and staff support. This year, this cost center is down 2.6% or approximately $4,000. This is predominantly due to a reduction in planned staff coursework, as well as a shift in technology and software costs out of this line and into the AOS budget. This cost center covers guidance counselors, social worker, and nurse salary and benefits, as well as student testing and computer hardware and software. Cost center number 6 is system administration. This represents Edgecombe's portion of the AOS budget, which includes central office business. This also covers legal fees, annual audit services, and things of that nature. This line item this year is up 17.7% or approximately $30,000. This is because over the last couple of years, there has been a decision in how to manage the AOS cost sharing for the position of the Director of Technology. Last year, the decision was made to bring that position out of the CSD, where it was a position that was supported by other schools through a stipend, and into the AOS budget so that it could be properly supported by all districts. In an effort to smooth over the budget implications, this decision was phased in a 2-year process. So, looking back 2 years in fiscal year 25, this line actually went down. Last year, it went up by about $32,000 due to the first of the 2 phases of integrating the Director of Technology. This year, it is up again as the second of 2 years for that change. We anticipate that this increase should flatten in years to come. Cost Center 7 covers school administration. This is the building principal and administrative assistant salary and benefits and other front office needs, and it is down 2.6% or approximately $6,000, predominantly due to changes in salary and insurance costs. The current number in this cost center is down 1.8% or approximately $3,000 from last year. This is predominantly due to the completed purchase of the van, as well as the development of a plan for streamlined maintenance. This covers the salary and benefits of bus and van drivers, as well as vehicles maintenance and fuel, and has been an area of ongoing work done by the board and the building administration this year. Cost Center 9 is facilities and maintenance. This is up 8.7% or approximately $30,000. This change is due predominantly to rising costs of utilities and building insurance, as well as an approximately $12,000 plan for replacing the external doors. This line item includes custodial staff salaries and benefits, cleaning, repair supplies to buildings, and minor and short-term building and grounds upkeep and maintenance. Cost Center 10 is debt service. This line is reserved for the repayment of loans for school construction. Edgecombe has none at this time, so this cost center is 0. Cost Center 11, the last cost center, is all other expenditures. This currently is up 96.6%, which is an approximate increase of $33,000. Cost Center 11 for Edgecombe Eddy has historically covered the costs of the school lunch and school nutrition program. Historically, Edgecombe has contracted with the CSD to bring in food and staff from their kitchens and staff for all nutritional and school food services. Edgecombe Eddy has therefore funneled all of our relevant state and federal reimbursement to the CSD. We have only been paying for the cost of their portion of work. That contract with their kitchen has averaged around $35,000 over the last couple of years. The proposed change to this cost center includes hiring 1 full-time staff member who would move food preparation out of the CSD kitchen and into the in-house kitchen at Edgecombe Eddy School. There are 2 main goals in this. One is to improve the efficiency of the use of current staff time, many of whom are required to spend time overseeing and supporting snack and school meals. It is also designed to improve the quality of meal preparation simply by ensuring that food is as fresh as possible. The proposed increased costs in this cost center include salary and benefits, as well as an $8,500 one-time equipment cost. The annual real costs for moving this position in-house are unknown, as grant funding around school nutrition programs will decrease costs moving forward in the future. Overall, all of these expenditures, as currently written, create a 9.2 increase in expenditures. That is an increase of approximately $380,000. This occurs for a couple of reasons. There are some increased special education needs. We are in year 2 of 2 of increases at the AOS level. We have increased outgoing tuition costs due to the number of students in grades 7 through 12, as well as increased utility costs and 2 choices, both to replace the exterior doors for additional safety and to bring in kitchen staff for additional quality and efficiency. The other question that always comes up when considering budget is the question of what is this going to cost the taxpayer, or what is the local assessment to taxpayers going to be? And here is where we need to stop and talk about use of unassigned funds. The use of available funds to offset the assessment to property taxes has been between $488,000 and $150,000 over the past several years. The lack of the most current audit, particularly fiscal year 2024, limits the board's ability to be as bold with this choice as we would like to. The school board does recognize that the assessment is the bottom line. It is the cost paid by local taxpayers. Historically, the board has conservatively estimated these educationally designated but unspent funds for use to offset taxes. However, after the 2025 town meeting, we decided to try to maximize the use of these funds. When the adopted budget was presented to the Budget Committee in February, the school board made this intention clear. The use of $50,000 in unassigned funds in the budget as it currently exists was clearly stated to be a placeholder amount. The school board anticipates offering a friendly amendment increasing this amount. We will be able to do that most accurately as close as possible to the May 2nd meeting date. Looking back at the history of both expenditures and assessment totals since 2016 and 2017, we will notice a couple of trends. Total EES expenditures by fiscal year increased slowly from 2017 to 2022, showed a small decrease going into 2023, and then has continued to increase at a predictable rate. Looking at the assessment totals going all the way back to 2016 and comparing those to a 4% annual COLA increase, you will recognize that despite a couple of years of significant increases, the overall trend over the past decade keeps the assessment total in line with cost of living increases. Recent increases have appeared to be much more significant due to the fact that for 3 consecutive years in 2020, 21, and 2022, significant dents were made into the unassigned fund to reduce the assessment to the taxpayers, as we were beginning to come out of the results of the COVID-19 pandemic. The other historical trend that the board really tries to pay attention to is the percent of town taxes that are going towards education. Once again, looking back at 2015 and 2016, before the beginning of the tuition in program, the percentage of town taxes for education were higher than 60%, peaking at almost 62.5%. Since then, those numbers have dropped below 60%, and most recently were 54% of the 2025 tax year. School budgets are adopted through a series of warrant articles. Warrant articles are written so that the voters in a town like Edgecombe authorize elected officials to raise, appropriate, and expend funds. Those 3 terms have very specific meanings. Raising funds means taxing local citizens in order to generate the money necessary to do whatever the town has decided. Appropriating those funds means that those funds are set aside and assigned for a certain purpose, and then expending that money means to actually spend it. The way the school board warrant articles are written, the warrant articles start with the planned expenses and then work backwards in order to fund those agreed upon expenses. Here is some example warrant article language. You will see in this example, Article 7 is asking for permission to expend money. That means we're looking for permission to actually spend funds. This sample Article 13 is asking for permission to appropriate funds. That means designate those funds as being designed for that specific purpose. And sample Article 20 is asking for permission to both appropriate and expend, meaning set aside that money and expend it as needed. This year, as in most years, the warrant articles follow a similar format. Article 1 is to elect a moderator to preside over the town meeting, and Articles 2 through 12 authorize the expenditure of funds in each of the cost centers described earlier in this presentation. Article 16 is for the total school budget. Article 16 is asking for permission to expend all of the money needed to fund the cost centers in Articles 2 through 12. In other words, the fund in Article 16 is going to equal the total amount from each of the cost centers in Articles 2 through 12. Once the expenditure amounts in each of the cost centers have been established in warrant Articles 2 through 12, warrant Articles 13, 14, and 15 are designed to raise and appropriate the funds necessary to meet those expenses. The state of Maine relies on a funding formula called EPS, or the Essential Programs and Services, in order to determine funding of state subsidies. Municipalities must raise a certain amount of money to receive this state subsidy. That amount is called the state and local EPS funding allocation. All money raised above this amount is referred to as additional local funds. Those two amounts are voted on separately. So, warrant Article 13 raises the amount of money that the state essential programs and services formula says we must raise in order to receive the state subsidy. Article 13 also allows us to appropriate that amount of money plus our anticipated state subsidy to set aside for educational funding. Article 14 is designed to raise and appropriate funds for debt services, which we have none of at this time, so that article is 0. And Article 15 is designed to raise and appropriate the additional local funds. These are the funds over and above the EPS funding formula minimum that are required to meet the budgeted expenditures. The state requires a written ballot for this article, so this is a moment in the town meeting where we will pause and take a written vote. It's important to remember that the total raised through the raising and appropriating warrant articles are less than the total expenditures due to the budgeted amount of funds in tuition revenue and other forms of revenue. There are several other additional articles. Articles 17, 18, and 19 do not involve raising money through taxes or allocating funds that are not already set aside for educational purposes. This is why these are separate categories of warrant articles. They are designed to allow voter oversight. Article 17 allows the school to spend state and federal funds and grants. Article 18 allows the school to spend additional state subsidy funds if they should occur. And Article 19 allows the school to move existing funds between cost centers. The law allows for the school board to authorize the movement of funds up to 5% between cost centers. Article 19 would allow funds larger than 5% to be moved between cost centers if necessary. Articles 20 and 21 do not involve raising money through taxes or allocating funds. They do involve reallocating or appropriating funds from the unassigned fund balance, which is made up of money already set aside for educational purposes. But this is designed to allow some of those funds to be moved into a specified reserve account. This is why these articles are in a separate category. Again, approving these articles does not cost more money. Article 20 allows the school to appropriate up to $25,000 of unspent funds into the capital reserve account and to expend those funds as needed. And Article 21 would allow the school to appropriate up to $150,000 of unspent funds into the student expense reserve account and expend those funds as needed with select board approval. It's important to pause here and consider the history of the reserve accounts. The Capital Reserve Account was established by voters in 2020 and was funded with up to $230,000 at that time, as well as an additional $50,000 in 2023. The other fund was established under the name Contingency Fund Account in 2021, funded up to $140,000, and then renamed the Student Expense Reserve Account in 2023. In the spring of 2023, both of these accounts worked as designed to avoid the need to access town reserves or a commercial bank loan in the middle of a fiscal year. The Capital Reserve Account was used with specific permission of voters and the Select Board in a special town meeting to address unbudgeted expenses related to well and water system issues. The Student Expense Reserve Account was used with the specific permission of voters and the Select Board, again in a special town meeting, to address unbudgeted and unanticipated student needs. Since then, in the spring of both 2024 and 2025, the town voters have authorized appropriating up to certain amounts of money to refund those accounts. However, despite the fact that the voters have repeatedly granted the school board the authority to appropriate these funds, the school board has chosen not to authorize such an appropriation until we receive the fiscal year 2024 audit in order to comply with the most accurate and updated financial information. The 2026 proposed warrant article simply articulates the continued will of the voters to refund these accounts. It does not mean that the school board would be adding the total of the recent few years' amounts to those reserve accounts. Authorizing these accounts and warrant articles also does not increase taxes at this time. It's important to put the larger budget in perspective. The Edgecombe School Board administration and staff fully support the proposed budget as a balance between the needs of students and the pressures on taxpayers. We recognize that education is expensive, but we reject the narrative that Edgecombe education is more expensive than usual. The state collects data every year and calculates the cost per student, both in some of the various cost centers and overall. This state data can be found online. The most recent year is 24-25. In that year, Edgecombe's cost per student, as shown in various cost center categories, and its overall cost per student comes in at or slightly above or slightly below the state average. Edgecombe's overall cost per student was calculated at this year at $21,158 at a time when the state average was $19,800. It's also important to put some of these numbers in perspective of surrounding districts. The same year, Wiscasset's cost per student total was calculated at more than $25,000 per student. RSU 1's was calculated at an even greater number, $25,424. Great Salt Bay's was calculated at $19,016, and the Booth Bay Harbor CSD was calculated at $27,320. So, the narrative that Edgecombe education is overly expensive is simply false. Looked at another way, based on fiscal year 24 data and simply calculated as the overall expense divided by the number of students educated, a simpler formula than the one used by the state, Edgecombe's cost per student continues to be similar to that of surrounding districts. We are in the middle of this chart, slightly higher than Wiscasset, Brunswick, and Portland, but lower than the CSD, RSU 1, and Islesboro, tossed in for fun, just to give a demonstration of how skewed this data can sometimes be. It's important to understand that while the expenses per student incurred to educate Edgecombe citizens is not higher than average, our tax assessment is. And here's why. The state funding for education, provided in the form of a state subsidy, is provided and calculated through a funding formula referred to as the EPS funding formula. It is true that Maine's annual state budget covers 55% of the overall cost of public education for the whole state. However, The amount of subsidy that each town receives is not guaranteed to be 55% of their expenditures. This is because the subsidy amount is determined by this EPS funding formula, and it diverts funds from towns with high property values to towns with fewer resources. This data is available online in the form of an ED 279 form, but I've provided some simple examples here. In fiscal year 26, Edgecombe received a state subsidy of $468,000, which was only 11.25% of the Edgecombe expenditures, keeping in mind that those expenditures per student are within the range of the state average. Compare this to the state subsidy received by the town of Lisbon, which was a state subsidy of more than $70 million, calculated at 60% of the expenditures of the Lisbon School District. The Bangor Daily News published an article not that long ago that allows for readers to compare the Maine School District subsidy allocations for different communities. The pie charts shown here show the local contribution, meaning money created by local tax assessments, in orange, and the adjusted state contribution, or the percentage of the overall expenditures covered by the state subsidy, in black. You'll see that the Fiddlehead School of Arts and Sciences, because it is a charter school, receives 100% of its expenses covered by state subsidy. Machias Public Schools receive more than 75%. RSU1 receives close to 55%, whereas Edgecombe is receiving less than 20%, and Boothbay Harbor is receiving even less. This is because, again, towns with higher property values receive less state subsidy based on the logic that they can raise more money with a lower mill rate than communities with lower property values. Communities with extremely high property values are considered minimum receiver towns, and they can receive a state subsidy equal to only 50% of previous year's special education costs. While all of this information is true and important, none of it answers the question often asked by local citizens. My taxes are too high. Why? Here's why. The EPS funding formula is designed to provide educational equity to lower income communities. It does this by assuming that high property value automatically means that the residing household can afford to pay larger amounts of annual local taxes. This is not true in many communities in Maine, particularly waterfront towns that have both large, expensive second homes driving up local property values and local families surviving on fixed or low incomes. This disparity is why the Edgecombe School Board, along with the support of members of the Select Board and the Budget Committee, took the opportunity this spring to testify to the State Legislative, Executive, and Education Committee about the importance of altering the current funding formula, as well as updating the tuition calculations. Here are some of the recommendations that we made to support success in Edgecombe, both in terms of educational quality and affordability, but also in terms of the ability of our local citizens to continue to pay property taxes and live in this amazing community. We asked for several things. We asked for the model of adequacy defined in the EPS funding formula to better meet the baseline of small schools to ensure that all of those schools receive additional state funding. We spoke about some of the data issued in the supporting MEPRI report, in which the updated model of adequacy is predicted to have the largest potentially negative effects on school districts such as CSDs and other areas with non-K-12 resident students. We asked for the legislature to consider addressing the formula for calculating tuition expectations. We asked that they ensure that a municipality's ability to pay is both sufficient for local education costs and clearly identified as a state mandate. And we asked that they identify further opportunities for direct financial support for all communities to reduce the burden of local taxes on those residents with the lowest ability to pay. The point we drove home again and again is that the use of property value alone to calculate the ability to pay for education places a disproportionately negative impact on some of the longest standing members of communities such as Edgecombe. We will continue to advocate for funding calculations that fully fund education and meet the needs of struggling students. So, given all of this information, please keep in mind some of the following dates. The school budget warrant articles will be discussed and voted on in a town meeting on Saturday, May 2nd at 10 a.m. at Edgecombe Eddy School. Please arrive early. That budget is then adopted or rejected by a budget validation referendum vote on Saturday, May 16th at the town hall. We encourage attendance. We encourage all citizens to get and share information from the Edgecombe Eddy School Board. We encourage you to check out a new website, edgecomelearns.org, to gather more information about schools, school policy, and school funding. And we encourage you and others to watch this and other presentations at Sinclair Schools. Thank you for taking the time to learn and be invested in your local community. See you soon.